No, you are ethnically Jewish yourself, right?
Oh, sure, sure.
Yeah, so I mean, you're one of the, I guess, the main sources of authority in terms of going in depth on the history of the 20th century, investigating like the rise of Jewish power, but also specifically, this idea of Jewish supremacy and its roots in the Talmud and Jewish history. I guess people would be curious, like, what sent you down that avenue? I know you have kind of a conservative background in politics, but obviously that's quite a third rail. Yeah, what made you investigate that, or what did you think? What brought you to the relevance of that today?
Well, I mean, to be honest, obviously, if we're talking about early indications, probably it was the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 that first shocked me, including, for example, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, where hundreds of Palestinians were massacred in an effort orchestrated by the Israeli government and Ariel Sharon. And I think it really shocked the entire world. It certainly shocked the American government and many global entities at that point. And to be honest, I mean, what interesting enough, in some of my articles, I've mentioned that at the time, for example, I was reading The Economist. And one of the individuals who published a couple of letters every now and then in The Economist was somebody named Israel Shahak, who was sort of sort of what I believed at the time was some sort of crazy Israeli communist figure in the Israeli Communist Party. I disregarded what he said. I mean, in other words, he made all sorts of wild accusations about the Israeli government and what it was planning. And one of those had actually been that the Israelis probably would orchestrate a massacre of the Palestinians. And, I saw his letter in The Economist. I completely disregarded it because I considered him just a ridiculous figure. And then that's exactly what happened just a few weeks later. So at that point, I really started recalibrating, doing what I call a recalibration of my reality detection apparatus. In other words, I suddenly decided that there might be things going on in the world that were very different than I imagined. And, certainly as time went by in the 80s, with many of the repeated efforts by the Israeli government and the refusals to make peace with the Palestinians, I became more and more concerned about that. And that certainly spread out into the 1990s as well. Now, it was probably I think it probably was around in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, that I started seeing some mention of Shahak's books and writings on the internet. And I just became curious. And, since I'd remembered his name from before, started investigating them. And some of the things he wrote were absolutely astonishing to me. In other words, I don't come from any sort of a religious background. So, I was vaguely familiar with the Talmud and the Old Testament and that sort of thing, but certainly none of the details of it. And when I ended up, ordering a couple of his books from Amazon, short books, and reading them and seeing how glowingly they were endorsed by leading public intellectuals like Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, Christopher Hitchens, Gore Vidal, I really, was shocked by what I read. And again, he himself was not at all a religious figure, but he was apparently a well-regarded professor of chemistry at one of the big Israeli universities. And he'd become, outraged over the things his government was doing on human rights issues. So he'd become involved in that thing. And he wasn't any sort of a communist or anything like that. He was basically just, at least in the words of most of the people around him, more of a sort of liberal humanitarian. And I mean, to see, for example, his government involved in mass killings like that, killings of innocent women and children, and to discover himself that much of it was based on the religious teachings of the Talmud utterly shocked and amazed him. So he started investigating that, and he wrote a couple of books. I mean, again, his books seemed to be well endorsed, well regarded. In fact, one of his co-authors on one of those books was a well-regarded American professor, also of Jewish heritage. So it's simply a question of a lot of people who aren't religious may be unfamiliar with the underlying doctrines of a religion that obviously motivates a lot of people in other communities. And, I mean, the whole thing about it is the Talmud is something that probably very, very few ordinary American Jews are aware of today. I mean, I would guess a couple of percent, maybe 1%, something like that. But on the other hand, Jews for probably 1,000 or 2,000 years lived in communities led by rabbis who followed the Talmud very, very strongly. And so, again, I think probably a lot of the sentiments of the Talmud seeped into the larger Jewish culture over that period of time. And the fact that most Jews are simply unaware of that, I think makes those sentiments in some ways more powerful and more effective. And I mean, one of the things basically in the Talmud is that non-Jews are regarded as animals in the shapes of men. In other words, they have no divine souls. And in fact, just a few years ago, I think it was a decade or so ago, a prominent Israeli rabbi explicitly said that the fingernail of a single Jew is worth more than the lives of 1 million non-Jews. I mean, that's very strong language. And, there are many different religions around the world which practice a lot of beliefs that, I'm not religious myself, that, may be strange or disconcerting, but I'm not aware of any other religions that have such an explicitly strong sentiment. In fact, I remember at the time I ended up reading Shahak's books, I was joking actually to a Jewish friend of mine that, what we regard as sort of Nazi doctrine may be regarded as Judaism for wimps, or Judaism as interpreted by Mother Teresa of Calcutta. In other words, a very, very softened view of it. And in fact, there seems to be some evidence that the Nazi doctrine may have been partly based on the notion of sort of modeling itself after Judaism in terms of its sort of explicit notion of sort of a powerful race, a more successful race, a more important race. Now, again, most peoples have that. In other words, most peoples around the world generally regard themselves as better than their neighbors, or certainly better than their rivals. But I mean, the notion of, saying that the lives of all non-Jews count for absolutely nothing and can be killed at random. I mean, for example, one of the aspects of, some of these rabbinical doctrines is that if, for example, if a Jew needs a liver, it's certainly reasonable and even required that he would kill an innocent Gentile and take his living. So, I mean, again, when you have a religion with such extreme sentiments around, and, the country practicing that religion, where, a large fraction of the population follow it explicitly, is now committing such a gigantic global massacre of innocent civilians in Gaza. I mean, I think there's probably a connection between those two things. And, it's the sort of thing, again, I'm not certainly saying that most Jews are aware of these doctrines. In fact, probably most Jews aren't. But when these doctrines have been such an important part of traditional Judaism for hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of years, it certainly becomes part of the larger culture that influences non-religious Jews as well. And I mean, that's, certainly a very serious problem right now in the world with, probably by now close to 30,000 innocent Palestinian civilians have died in the Israeli retaliation for that original Hamas attack.